Well, hi, willkommen, bienvenue, welcome, oui, fremder, étranger, stranger, oui, glücklich zu sehen, je suis enchanté, welcome, resta, bleibe, hey, stay. So, welcome to Cabaret. We had to inevitably get to this. Transgender history, we are going to touch on Berlin in the Roaring Twenties and, tragically, through the 30s. However, I am not here to tell you tales of woe. We have enough of those. Let's leave you with a tale of hope and joy. Always good. So, to speak about the Berlin gay and particularly they called it transvestite, transgender scene, we're going to talk about Magnus Hirschfeld. But we're also going to talk about Dora Richter. Now, Magnus Hirschfeld, very interesting figure. So, he is an early sexologist from the 19th century, and it was a new field at the time. There's been one or two people, and I will do videos on this, but one or two people who have started to do a study of gender and sexuality in human beings as an actual study. Now, Hirschfeld got his medical degree in, I believe, 1892. He was a gay man. He had a bit of wanderlust, was very, very well travelled over his life. He went to the USA, went to Chicago exhibition and so on. He actually became part of the gay scene in Chicago at the time. It was a city that had a substantial underground gay scene at the end of the 19th century. He was publishing a lot for journals, and he began to sort of move about looking for his place in a medical landscape. As a gay man, he began dealing with largely gay patients, and he began to realize something. When he got back to Germany and started up his practice, he found a lot of gay patients had, essentially the term was suicide marks. They had marks on them from suicide attempts, or essentially self-inflicted wounds from what we would know today as cutting. And he began to be quite alarmed by this and do a study. He put out a series of questionnaires which people could do under pseudonyms, so your privacy was assured. And back came the data, and it showed an alarming discrepancy between the number of homosexual patients who had attempted suicide versus the number of heterosexual patients. Far more homosexual patients. And the coroner's records of actual deaths seemed to back this up as he checked into the lives of people who had killed themselves. And very alarmingly, of course, the highest suicide section of the population was, of course, what they called at the time transvestites. We now know that largely as transgender. There were some honest-to-God cross-dressers and so on involved there, but essentially it was a transgender people, just under a different term at the time. He published some books on the subject, and these were formative. These were the first actual scholastic studies being done on the psychology of homosexual and particularly transvestite people. He was also extremely engaged by the Oscar Wilde trials. For those of you who don't know, Oscar Wilde was actually taken to court for being gay, taken to court for basically, spreading his dissolute ways amongst young men, etc. Very, very public, and it destroyed Wilde, just destroyed him. And they put him in jail hard labour, and he finally vanished over to, I believe Nice was where he went into exile. So the story of Oscar Wilde is not a happy one, but this just shattered Hirschfeld, who was, as a gay man, felt a kinship with this. He attended some meetings, and in fact attended a meeting in England where gay men just met in a glade in the forest, and they stood about reading Oscar Wilde's works, including a ballad that Oscar Wilde wrote about being in prison and just seeing the beatings and the executions all around him. Horrifying stuff. No, Oscar Wilde's life is not all bon mots and flowers. But this galvanised Hirschfeld even further. During World War I, he was engaged as a medical professional, obviously, all hands on deck, but working with early psychology and PTSD, shell shock. And he did actually notice that there was a substantial amount of homosexuality in the upper echelons of the Prussian nobility, which therefore turned into German military high command. Substantial amounts of it. And some of this came out after the war, when various high-ranking military officers were put on trial for homosexuality, and Hirschfeld came out as an expert witness to say that yes, they were, but it's a immutable psychological thing. It's not a choice of behaviour. So therefore these people should not be pursued as choosing a behaviour. Because in his studies, Hirschfeld had begun to edge onto a radical new idea. Every sexologist before him had said that homosexual people are mentally ill. There is a mental aberration or a genetic aberration which makes them homosexual, and they are essentially a people that have some kind of sickness, which we have to learn how to deal with, and etc. Some of these early sexologists, and that's why I said I'll do more on them, they're fucking dreadful, horrifying human beings, would gladly dig up their graves and dance up and down on their sticky bones any day, because their whole thing was, these people need to be just edited out of the human race. But that's all right. They're gay, so they're doing that anyway. Does that sound familiar to everyone? Hirschfeld, on the other hand, had this idea. Now, Germany at that time was a colonial power, before World War I in any case, and they would do this thing, God help us, human zoos. They would bring over natives from their colonial areas and put them on display. So, people from New Guinea, Marshall Islanders, Hereros from southern Africa, all these different tribes and groups. And you could sort of see them. You could go and see them in like a simulation of their home environment. In Berlin, you could go to the exhibition. Well, Hirschfeld had done that in pre-war days. But what he had done is he had taken translators with him, and he'd sat down with each of these native peoples and asked them about sexuality and gender in their own cultures, and had begun to get a very broad view of sexuality and gender, homosexuality and heterosexuality in cultures beyond his own. With further travels, which included going to India, Indonesia, Java, he went through America, I believe he went to Argentina, he went to all kinds of different places and spoke to the native cultures there. The work he was publishing came to a conclusion that gender and sexuality exists on a broad spectrum within humans, and this can vary wildly between individuals, and that it is perfectly natural for it to do so. And that the only thing that locks in one set of behaviours on that rainbow arc as being acceptable or unacceptable is socialisation. Your society has a narrow band very often of saying what it will accept, but that doesn't mean that it isn't. Other behaviours are aberrant and wrong. They are perfectly natural. Gender tends to express itself in individuals in different ways, and it is not tied to a person's sexuality. This was groundbreaking work, absolutely groundbreaking. We owe this man a lot. So after the war in 1919, he set up several different things. Now, throughout Europe, homosexuality was seen in many different ways. Wackily enough, the Napoleonic legal code does not criminalise male homosexuality. And like most codes, it just ignores female homosexuality. It's just, that doesn't exist. We don't care. It's only male because only that seems to threaten the patriarchy. Right. So, France has no laws against homosexuality. Explaining why people tended to flee off to Nice. Now, areas of Europe that had been absorbed by the French Empire during Napoleon Bonaparte's reign had, for a long time, also had Napoleonic law codes. So that includes places like Bavaria, certain parts of Italy, Naples, etc., Kingdom of Italy, Sardinia, but it also included large sections of Germany. The Confederation of the Rhine was essentially a French satellite state that had been set up, and it was most of the Rhine states, Kleefberg, Hesse-Darmstadt, these sorts of places. But that whole Rhine state area had the Napoleonic legal code. So they had a tradition of really not giving a stuff about homosexuality. The Prussian legal code had the infamous paragraph 175, which made sexual relations between men illegal. Now, this is actually very strange because Frederick the Great of Prussia, who was, let's be very clear, an appalling man, and German history has rewritten him as a mighty warrior and a hero. As a historian of the European 18th century, I can tell you he was none of these, but what he was extremely gay. So it's this weird kind of denial, I guess, that they almost like created this Teutonic warrior cult, which, you know, we're still dealing with the echoes of it today, based around this masculine image that pushed itself away from homosexuality when their head of state was extremely gay, misogynistically male gay as well. Blech. A combo. But anyway, there's paragraph 175. Hirschfeld sets up the Institute of Sexual Studies, and he sets it up in Berlin, and weirdly enough, he actually sets it up in a very ritzy area of Berlin. This is the area where all the great surgical training institutes and medical research institutes are. He's in there with the best of them. This isn't like crammed in a corner of the red light district or anything. This is right there. It's still a palace district. I believe the only kind of surviving Prussian era palace is still, you know, in this section of Berlin today. So it's very public and very, very seen. He also set up the Society for Studying Human Sexuality, and also a Society for Human Rights. Part of that human rights struggle was to decriminalise homosexuality and transvesticism. He got many, many, many signatories to this society. That included luminaries of the day, such as Albert Einstein, Leo Tolstoy, all the greats signed on to this, trying to get Prussia to remove Section 175 from its laws, and hopefully spearhead that through the rest of Europe, and then, you know, America, Britain, the world. This was their aim. And there really wasn't a great thinker of the time that was not signing on to this. So Hirschfeld was well known, and very well respected. Now, what happened in Berlin? So, post World War One, the authoritarian royal government of the Kaiser fell, and in comes the Weimar Republic. And the Weimar Republic was something of an explosion of reaction against the kind of drab authoritarianism of the military rule that had so characterized the rule of, the Second Reich there. So it was a time of much gaiety. People were moving away from the war and trying to essentially overwrite that horror in their minds with gaiety. This is the time when you find so many amazing movements. In the USA, this is where you get things like jazz music and so on breaking out. It breaks out big time in Germany as well. This is one of the reasons the Nazis were so frenzied against it, because it was such an incredible breaking of social norms. 20s jazz is like the punk rock of its era. German expressionism in art and painting comes out. You need to look up artists like Egon Schiele and so on, and see what they're working with, moving from the horror of the war and trying to find new expression. And that's the key, because part of this finding new expression comes in sexuality and gender. People are wanting to express this in ways that were forbidden in earlier times. The Reich having been set up as it was, Berlin was a transportation hub. All roads basically led to Berlin. So Berlin was therefore the most important cultural centre of Germany. And this is mainly where gay culture at the time set up. It did also appear in many of those places that had the Napoleonic Code, and in places that got a lot of trade and so forth. Hamburg also had something of a gay community and something of a cabaret community, but Berlin was the place. That's where gay community, art community, music community met. And that's where we get these cabarets, these amazing cabarets, which Berlin was famous for, which tended to be gay and transvestite clubs. Now, there were dedicated transvestite clubs where you could just go and meet, and there were stage acts and everything. There were also just gay and lesbian clubs as well. A broad spectrum. But it was really a pretty amazing place to be. By the way, if you have not ever seen the movie Cabaret, do see it. It is a movie about this period. It is actually from an autobiographical work. It is a horrifying story, actually. All the bright songs, life is a cabaret, old chum. No, it's a story that looks hauntingly familiar to the USA today, as authoritarianism goes through the whole place like a cancer and destroys it. Good times. Anyway, cabaret culture provided an umbrella under which gay and transvestite culture could start to flourish. Magazines began to come out so that people could meet each other. They were sold at newsagents throughout Germany, and they had contact sections at the back where you could say, hi, I'm in this town, I'm gay, I'm lonely, I don't have any friends. And you could write into the magazine, and they sort of had the advertiser's address and so on. And if your kind of bona fides checked out, they checked up as best they could. They'd send you each other's addresses so you could meet each other, or start a little gay club where you were. It was the start of gay community. Laws would come down on these magazines because they would say, they are filth, and you're not allowed to sell filth at newsagents. So what they would do then is sell them by subscription, but you could put up a notice at a newsagent saying you can subscribe to this magazine here at this newsagent. Less sales, obviously, than just having the thing there for people to pull out of the racks and idly, grab hold of, but still there. So it was successful. Now, this is where Hirschfeld has set up his institute. And his institute was very important. Many people who were transvestite could not get work, because when they tried to get work, they were told in a male form that they were too effeminate, so no one would hire them, and in their female form, no one will hire them. There are some niches for like cabaret performers and waiters and waitresses and etc., but that's not enough for the population. There's people who can't. So one of the things that Hirschfeld did was institute was buoyed up by subscriptions because all these intellectual greats supported him. Money came in internationally to support the institute. He had a fairly large building for it, so he would hire particularly transvestite women as the staff, cleaning staff, cooking staff and so forth, as well as clerical staff, admin staff and medical assistants, trained nurses. He would train them as nurses. And the reason they needed cooking and cleaning staff is because he had essentially a residential section of the institute where he was providing accommodation for transvestite women, and they could stay with him, and often they stayed and they worked. They paid their way by just sort of like helping clean and helping run the place. And of course these are the people who he was running studies on for his psychology publications and his foundation work. This institute amassed a huge library of work on transgenderism and what it meant and how it manifested and what people's journey were, how they conceived of themselves, and that's what makes Magnus Hirschfeld so valuable, because he, as a gay man, didn't plunge in and give judgments. He asked a community of people how they perceived of themselves. Do you think of yourself as a woman? When did you start thinking of yourself as a woman? Questions no one had ever asked before. So, at this place, this was where hormone therapies were first really begun, the creation of artificial hormones, groundbreaking work, but also gender reassignment surgery. This is where it was pioneered. Now into this works a woman called Dora Richter. Dora had come from an region called Bohemia. Ironically enough, the same area that sodding Hitler came from. But had always been kind of thought of as an effeminate person where they came from, had always dressed in women's clothes and wanted to be a girl. Said they were a girl as a child, wanted to be a girl. Had moved into Berlin after a kind of a long journey. During World War One, Dora, in their male form of course, had actually been conscripted into the army and were booted out 2 weeks later because of their transvestitism. They would, the moment they were off duty, they would put on women's clothes and live as a woman. This person, this was the 1914 to 1918 version of Maxwell Klinger. And so they yeeted them out of the army as quickly as possible. Given the large homosexual population in high command, it was probably all that could keep them keeping their mind on the job. But Dora had turned up in Berlin as the Weimar Republic sort of spread to try and live within that gay and trans community. Got some jobs as like a waitress at some of these cabarets, and Dora must have been a pretty good cook, because she ended up as chef at one of the cabarets, but she moved in to Hirschfeld's Institute. And there she did work sort of as a maid and so on, but she also seems to have taken over the cooking and catering duties for everyone, and everyone seems to have been well pleased. I think she was good at this job, as we'll see later. Magnus adored her and had a pet name for her, Dorchen. They weren't a couple, but he just adored her. No, he was definitely into very butch men. But she became one of his core patients. So, 1922, I believe, Dora actually had an orchiectomy and went on to the first kind of experimental hormone treatments. And the body responses were a core part of Hirschfeld's research. He wrote how amazingly overjoyed she was, and everyone was, at the way her body responded. So the breast formation has begun. The female abdominal, fat pad has begun. The waist, the hair, the voice. This is working. This is actually a thing. Let me just double check. Was it 1931? I believe it was 1931. Yeah. So yes, 1922 was when she had the orchiectomy. 1931, Dora had the world's first vaginoplasty. Had the first gender-affirming bottom surgery. And it was a success. She was it. The first trans woman who actually had, gender reassignment surgery into her chosen gender. And the technique worked. This is the pioneering work for surgical procedures for transgender people right there. After that, she seems to have really found herself somewhat. She actually became a waiter and then a chef at Kempinski's. Now, Kempinski's was sort of the la-di-da restaurant in Berlin at the time. World famous. It's the Savoy, it's the Ritz-Carlton of Berlin at the time. Very famous. She's one of the chefs there. So, this is a cordon bleu chef we're talking about here, I think. And that's where she was when the Nazis came in. So, when the Nazis came in, they assaulted the institute within 4 months of them coming in. First off, there was a gang of Nazi youths turned up, smashed in all the windows, and physically assaulted everyone who was inside the institute at the time. 4 hours later, a more orchestrated group of brown shirts came in and looted the entire institute. They took every book, every note, every journal, everything, every bit of research into transsexual psychology, all of these foundation works, all of the foundation material on surgeries and so on, and they took them. Now, there were some Danish surgeons who had been studying there. They were not present when this happened, and they got out. And they at least carried with them the skills that they learned from the gender reaffirming surgeries there, because they had witnessed and assisted. And this is why Denmark became such a centre for this post-war. Luckily, Hirschfeld was not in the institute at the time. The Nazis burned all this material. They destroyed it all gone. And we have never, ever recovered from that. The research that was done there, we still haven't been able to recover that body of lost knowledge. We're only starting to get there now. Just take 30 seconds out, pause the video and just say, I hate Nazis. There we go. Anyway, Hirschfeld was actually overseas at the time, travelling, and he was in France when the institute was destroyed, and of course decided he can't go back. He had already been attacked by Nazis on the streets a few times before, and had in fact been hospitalised after being brutalised by Nazis while, wandering about the place, minding his own sodding business. So he never went back. Now, he eventually died. When did he die? Somewhere in the late 30s, I think. He is actually buried in Nice, and I actually went to his gravesite there. And you can too. Now, with the institute destroyed and the people there scattered, everything went to hell. What had happened in Berlin was that Hirschfeld's institute allowed transgender people to get a diagnosis that they were transgender. he would write a piece of paper saying, I have evaluated this person and they are a transvestite. You could then take this to your local police station, and the local police chief would fill out a form, a transvestitkartieren, a transvestite pass, a passport, which said you are officially a transvestite. And if you had this, it stopped you being harassed by the police. They wouldn't arrest you for being dressed as a woman on the streets. You could pull this out and say, no, I'm actually an official transvestite. This was it wasn't the law, but it was a treaty that had kind of been made between this well-respected institute and the law to say we have to allow these people to move around. They are actually a thing. This is separate from male homosexuality, which Section 175 covers. This has nothing to do with that. This is a different thing entirely. But when the Nazis came in, they put transvestitism under Section 175. They said it's the same thing as being gay male, and therefore it is an offence, and therefore, they rounded them up. So, no more transvestite cartierans, obviously no new ones, because the institute is closed. That community just scattered, gay clubs gone, done, we're done. Any of them with any ability to do so fled the country, largely into France and then onwards to far off places, many to South America. We lost track of Dora, and it was thought that she had died because others had been swept up by the Nazis and just killed. But a magazine researcher in 1955 found Dora. And this is where it becomes a good story. Sorry. She lived, and she lived well. Dora left Berlin and she went back to Bohemia, which had become part of Czechoslovakia at that time. The president of Czechoslovakia had signed papers saying he recognized her as a woman. This was her official gender now. Dora Richter is a woman. Dora then settled in her native town and set up a restaurant and was doing okay. However, what happened, you will recall, the Nazis decided to annex Czechoslovakia. First they said there are native Germans here and they are obviously being cruelly mistreated by the Czechoslovakians. They weren't, but whatever. We must seize this, we must do the land grab. Does this sound familiar to anybody? And so they seized Czechoslovakia. But Dora kind of lay low, and her ID said she was a woman. Plus, she physically looked like a woman, so she actually didn't really have any trouble during the occupation. The restaurant business obviously went tits up because Nazis. However, she did survive as a lace maker, a hand lace maker of all things, and was churning out very high quality lace works for which there was still considerable demand. When the war was over, she actually moved to Bavaria, and there, she moved to Bavaria because when Czechoslovakia became a country again after World War II, it evicted all of the people who were of German ancestry. They kicked them out, so had to go. That's why she went. But she went to Bavaria, where she started another sodding restaurant. Dora Richter died in 1966, an old woman. She was in her mid-70s when she died, of natural causes. But she had lived a long and fruitful life. She'd escaped the Nazis. She had escaped the communist takeover of Czechoslovakia. She had escaped being killed on the front in World War I. She'd escaped it all. And she lived as a woman, and she lived as the pioneer for gender reassignment surgery. I'm so glad she got to live her life. I'm very proud of her, the way she could pull herself up of ashes time and time again and make a new and meaningful life for herself. What a star. What a star. So, next time you go to a pride parade, hoist a glass to Dora and hoist a glass to Magnus Hirschfeld, to whom we owe so much. And if you're ever in Nice, hoist a glass to him there as well. A hard tale, but there's Dora's happy ending at the end of it. And there's a happy ending for all of us at the end of it. Because the light that Hirschfeld managed to kindle still burns. Those books were burned, but the drive and the love were not. Those surgical techniques did manage to be reclaimed and now serve as the foundation for these techniques today. Hormone therapies that he pioneered are in use today. And that key psychological belief that sexuality exists on a spectrum and that none of it is wrong or aberrant. It's just that people tend to have different areas of the spectrum, both for sexuality, for gender presentation, and all of it is just entirely human. We owe that to Magnus. So, anyway, I will see you guys again soon. That was the whole tale of Magnus and Dora from Berlin. And, hey, maybe we'll see you guys at a Pride Parade someday. Whee! Much love. Look after yourselves out there. Be careful. Be seen. Be proud. Okay, bye.